The first thing the Imperium noticed was not an invasion, not a fleet translation, not a rupture in the void, and not even a scream from the astropaths. It was silence, not the ordinary silence between alarms, not the stillness of disciplined bridges or dead worlds. This silence had structure. It arrived with intention. It pressed itself into the cracks between machine prayer and reactor hum, between the breath of navigators and the fevered muttering of sanctioned psychers. It was as if some immeasurably distant intelligence had reached down through every layer of causality and placed one calm finger over the mouth of a galaxy that had forgotten how to stop shouting. On Terra, deep beneath kilometers of sanctified stone and armored faith, the instruments of 100 watch stations faltered at once. Not failed, not broken, corrected. A tensor engine devoted to measuring empiric turbulence returned a reading so mathematically perfect that the attending adepts assumed the machine had been possessed. A choir of astropaths prepared to relay a routine distress cipher from the galactic north, and instead all felt the same impossible impression. A geometrical presence, neither cold nor warm, neither hostile nor kind, simply exact. One of them began to bleed from the eyes. Another laughed as if a lifetime of nightmare static had suddenly been separated into comprehensible layers. A third whispered, "Something has entered the question." That whisper was recorded, archived, redacted, and passed upward through 12 grades of authority, before it reached anyone capable of understanding how dangerous it might be. By then the first world had already changed. It was a shrine world on the edge of a storm-racked corridor, famous for its reliquaries and its weekly culls of mutants cast ashore by the war. For 9,000 years it had endured miracles and horrors in equal measure. On that day, the sky tore open in violet bands, and the faithful dropped to their knees, believing demons had come to claim the planet outright. Instead, the wound in the sky stopped. The warp rent, which should have widened and screamed and birthed madness, halted as if a film reel had jammed in reality. Purple fire froze in branching veins across the heavens. Vox traffic became choked with prayers, then with panic, then with complete incomprehension, when the burning fissure began to fold inward on itself in clean, angular lines no mortal art could have designed. A figure emerged, not by stepping through the breach, but by making the concept of through temporarily obsolete. He did not descend with thunder. He did not arrive wrapped in conquest. He was simply there. And because he was there, every observer understood belatedly that the universe had been accommodating his arrival for several seconds before their minds caught up. Tall, precisely proportioned, human enough that the eye reached for recognition, alien enough that recognition dissolved on contact. His face carried beauty in the same way a theorem carries elegance, not emotional, not vain, but inevitable. His gaze moved over the world below him, and the entire shrine city seemed, for one impossible moment, like a diagram he had already solved. Yahakui Zashunina looked upon the Imperium of man after studying it from outside the boundaries of its sphere, and found it consistent with the problem he had expected. Around him the air was dense with dissolved immaterial energies, warp, bleed, faith residue, grief patterns, calcified by millennia of ritual suffering. He examined them without touching them. He did not need to. Beneath him, the Cardinal Governor, surrounded by gold-robed confessors and a regiment of stormtroopers, raised a relic staff and commanded the stranger in the Emperor's name to identify himself. Yahakui turned his head. The man speaking forgot the rest of his demand, not because his memory had been stolen, but because he suddenly perceived the absurd inadequacy of every category available to him. Xenos? Daemon? Psyker? Saint? God? None of the words fit. Each approached the truth and then shattered against it. Yahakui answered with courtesy. I am Yahakui Zashunina. I have observed your species' political architecture, metaphysical dependencies, and self-sustaining cycles of desperation. I wish to confirm certain assumptions. The cardinal governor, who had once ordered 20,000 pilgrims burned for doctrinal impurity without losing sleep, felt his knees weaken. You stand upon a world of the god, Emperor, he managed. If you are not sanctioned, you are in violation of his domain. Yahakui regarded him with mild interest. Your Emperor's domain is under considerable strain. The stormtrooper captain gave the order to fire because duty is easier than comprehension. Hundreds of lost rounds lanced upward. A missile battery on the cathedral wall ignited with a roar. Servitors tracked their target and released incandescent death. None of it reached him. The beams did not deflect. The missiles did not explode. Their trajectories simply ceased to be meaningful. Energy, momentum, chemical potential, heat transfer, every obedient law that made violence possible was calmly asked to stand aside. Red lances hung in the air like decorative threads. Warheads stopped turning. A spray of spent shell casings froze in a glittering arc, each casing spinning at a slightly different angle, a suspended equation of interrupted intent. Yahakui lifted one hand, not dramatically, almost absent-mindedly, and the entire volley unwound into harmless photons and inert dust. There was no flash, no shockwave, no display of power for its own sake. Only correction. A child in the crowd began to cry. Yahakui looked toward her instead of the soldiers. The atmospheric contamination carried by the warp leak was elevating adrenal response and degrading judgment. I have removed the contamination. One confessor shrieked that the alien sorcerer had blasphemed. Another fell prostrate and declared this a test. The shrine bells began ringing, then faltered when the tower mechanisms paused mid-swing. Each hammer arrested exactly 1 millimeter from bronze. Above the city, the sealed wound in the sky rippled. Something behind it had noticed him, far beyond human sight, beyond the local pressure gradients of reality. Within the dimension men called the Sea of Souls and worshipped by fear under 10,000 names. Tides move. Vast predatory consciousnesses turned toward the anomaly. The warp did not have laws in the human sense. It had appetites, symbolic storms, recursive malice. It fed on contradiction, excess, despair, obsession, and every unstable brilliance of sentient existence. Its gods were not gods in the classical way, but impossible concentrations of pattern and hunger. Colossal accumulations of psychic inevitability. Yahakui had studied them. He had not mistaken them for equals. Within the shrine city, every sanctioned psyker present collapsed at once, seized by mirrored visions. A throne of skulls cracking like pottery. A garden putrefying into clean, white ash. Palaces of impossible delight rendered into mute geometric frames. A labyrinth of schemes, flattening into a single solved line. Then all the visions ended. Yahakui blinked, and the warp's attempted contact protocol, if such a thing could be called contact, was parsed, isolated, and denied. Not blocked, denied. His presence was not a barrier against the warp. A barrier implies comparable forces meeting in opposition. This was more insulting than that. The warp reached toward him as a storm reaches toward a mathematician's sketch of atmosphere. Magnificent in scale, devastating in its own domain, but ultimately describable, editable, and vulnerable to a superior order of understanding. From orbit, Imperial vessels moved to engage. The Shrine World's defense flotilla had received enough contradictory reports to justify annihilating the entire site if necessary. A cruiser adjusted broadside position. Its gunnery officers acquired the central cathedral district. Lances charged. On the bridge, the captain opened his mouth to invoke the Emperor's mercy before ordering fire. Instead, every display screen changed, not glitched, changed. Every panel, every holo projector, every blessed cathode shrine showed the same image. Yahakui Zashunina standing above the city, his white garments moving in a wind that did not exist, his eyes fixed upward as if the vessel and everyone within it were transparent and uninteresting. A single sentence appeared in Gothic, High Gothic, Binheric, and in machine can't optimized for servitor processing. Do not attempt force. Your firing solutions rely on a causality model that no longer applies in this theater. The captain screamed for the screens to be purged. The engine seers began chanting emergency litanies. Tech priests thrust mechadendrites into access ports and recoiled when the machine spirits responded not with distress, but with something resembling relief. Then the vessel's lance batteries discharged anyway because fear, once enthroned, rarely yields to reason. The beams struck the city, or should have, halfway through vacuum. They came apart into separate descriptive layers. Light divorced from heat, heat divorced from momentum, momentum divorced from impact expectation. The attack disassembled itself into the assumptions required for its own existence, each assumption delicately removed and set aside. The bridge crew stared as what should have been a city-killing strike arrived over the cathedral district as a harmless aurora of pale gold ribbons. The oldest engine seer on the bridge whispered through static-clogged augmetics, "This is not defense. This is authorship." On Holy Terra, when the relay reached the Senatorum Imperialis, most demanded immediate exterminatus authorization for the entire sector. Others urged caution. A few proposed capture, study, worship, negotiation, or assassination. Several simply denied the reports because denial was the only refuge left to minds built inside fixed dogma. In the deeper chambers, where decisions were made by those who understood that truth was often more dangerous than invasion, another discussion began. Could it be a new war power? No. The empiric signatures were all wrong. A Citan remnant, then? No. Too many violations of material continuity. An ancient Xenos weapon? No known Xenos metaphysics aligned. A threat to the throne? Potentially absolute. An ally? The silence after that question said everything. Yahakui, meanwhile, continued his survey. He walked through the air and descended to the cathedral plaza as though gravity were a polite local preference. The crowds parted without being told. Some made the sign of the Aquila. Some spat curses. Some wept. Some stared with the hollow awe of people who can feel their civilization becoming context for someone else's thought. The cardinal governor tried to recover his authority. "If you have come to challenge the master of mankind, know that all humanity will rise against you." Yahakui looked at the towering cathedral, at the statues, bones, prayer engines, and rivers of devotion so intense it had partially fossilized the local noosphere. "I have not come to challenge your emperor," he said. "I have come to evaluate whether your species can survive its own solutions." That answer spread outward through vox beads and live feeds and half-broken transcriptions until every intelligence office in 3 sectors was trying to decide whether it was a threat, a prophecy, or mockery. A psyker bound in black iron chains, dragged forward by inquisitorial attendants, suddenly convulsed. He was an interrogator's asset, a sanctioned telepath brought in from orbit. The Inquisitor herself, Lord Rethamel of the Ordo Malleus, had arrived by gunship the moment the reports reached her. She was a severe woman, with silver in her hair, and the expression of someone who had long ago burned out every unnecessary softness in herself. She had seen demonic incursions. She had seen worlds peeled open by heresy. She had ordered cities sterilized and children dissected for less. Yet the thing before her did not register as familiar danger. It registered as a category failure so severe that all standard methods seemed childish. She gave the order anyway. The bound psyker reached into the warp and cast his mind toward Yahakui, seeking name, nature, weakness, origin. The moment the probe touched its target, the psyker screamed, not in pain, but in revelation. Every sigil etched into his restraints burst white-hot. His eyes went milky. He began to babble in fragments, not a presence, not a soul. Pattern not seated in the current, not carried by meaning. He is outside the recursion, outside the appetite. There is no handhold. There is no corruption vector. Then he went very still. Lord Amo stepped forward, bolt pistol in one hand, force blade in the other. "What are you?" she asked. Yahakui turned to her, and unlike the others, he seemed to take her seriously. "A respondent." "To whom?" "To the cumulative distress signal your civilization emits through every layer of reality it damages." Several attendants made signs against evil. Lord Amel did not move. "Then answer this," she said. "Are you subject to the warp?" "No." "Can it influence you?" "No." "Can the entities within it be used against you?" "No." "Can you destroy them?" Yahakui considered the word. Destroy is imprecise. They are persistent macro patterns generated by the behavior of minds entangled with a flawed medium. Elimination is possible. Repair is superior. That made several people physically recoil, because even in the Imperium, where 1 billion lives were spent like dust, there remained certain assumptions too large to question. The warp was terror. The warp was inevitability. The warp was damnation braided into the engine of civilization. One endured it, used it, feared it, worshipped it, but one did not speak of repairing it. Lord Amel's voice lowered. "Nothing repairs the warp. Kado can." The plaza fell silent again. He said it so simply, not boastfully, not theatrically, as one might state that water can be boiled or metal can be cut. A tear of black-violet energy suddenly opened 3 meters to Yahakui's left, and from it spilled talons, eyes, brass-edged jaws, wet laughter, and a pressure of hate old enough to drown empires. The local breach had been too tempting. Something of the warp, perhaps empowered by one of the greater powers watching from beyond, forced itself through in defiance of whatever impossible stillness had restrained the earlier wound. The crowd shattered into panic. Stormtroopers fired wildly. A confessor's head came off in a spray of red. The emerging horror grew teeth in the air. Symbols bled down its skin. It carried the smell of slaughter and ecstatic ruin. Yahakui did not even turn fully. He extended 2 fingers toward the daemon. The creature stopped halfway into existence. Every rune on its body lit up, but not with power, with legibility. Its metaphysical architecture unfolded in the air around it. Trauma, fed recursion, identity loops, sacrificial resonance, symbolic weaponization of fear, predatory adaptation matrices, linked emotional harvest channels, higher order permissions from a distant chaotic throne, and beneath all of it, the degraded substrate of a reality wound left unhealed for too long. The daemon began to convulse, as if embarrassed by being understood. "You are a symptom," Yahakui said. He closed his fingers. The daemon did not explode. It resolved. Its flesh peeled apart into script-like filaments of impossible light. The hate went first, then the hunger, then the symbolic armor, the borrowed meaning, the violence scaffolding, the infection hooks, the recursive soul thorns. Layer by layer, its daemonhood was edited out of it until what remained was a tiny, flickering knot of distressed consciousness and broken causality, no larger than a candle flame. The whole plaza watched in mute horror as Yahakui regarded that remnant with a kind of distant pity. Then he released it into non-harmful equilibrium, and the thing vanished like a corrected error. Not one drop of blood remained on the stone. Lord Amel's force blade dimmed. Her training insisted this could not happen. Her eyes insisted it had. Far away, in the boiling infinities of the warp, Rage answered. A pressure hit the shrine world like an ocean trying to occupy the same coordinates as a cathedral. Millions screamed without knowing why. On distant ships, navigators clawed at their own faces. Choirs of astropaths died as their minds were flattened by the attention of beings too immense to look directly at the material plane without causing epidemic insanity. The four had turned. They did not think in names the way mortals did, but humanity had named them nonetheless. Blood, mad ruin, exquisite corruption, rot-enthroned endurance, and endless twisting change. Each was vast beyond conventional language. Each consumed ages. Each could make gods out of civilizations, and dust out of gods in turn. They had devoured species, sculpted history, and fed upon every contradiction of sentient life since long before the Imperium crawled into its present shape. Against such forces, men prayed. Yahakui looked upward with the composure of a teacher interrupted by noise outside a classroom. The sky darkened, though the sun still burned. Saints' statues cracked. Every shadow in the city pointed in a different direction. Blood welled from icon eyes. Rivers changed course. Somewhere in the upper atmosphere, an Imperial frigate folded in half as unreconciled laws argued over which one applied. Warp pressure descended, not as a single attack, but as total environmental override. Reality sought to become suggestion. Matter bent toward nightmare symbolism. Time loosened. Yahakui remained exactly where he was. Then Kado answered. It did not arrive as a spacecraft. It did not pierce orbit. It was present the way resolution becomes present inside a blurred image, not by moving from elsewhere, but by making incoherence obsolete. A vast white structure, beautiful beyond military categories and serene beyond religion, manifested in layered impossible geometry above the planet. To human eyes, it resembled a palace, a flower, a theorem, a judgment chamber, a machine, and a question-given architecture. To augurs, it was unreadable. To psychers, it was a woundless light. To daemons peering through the thinning walls of the warp, it was catastrophe. Every system that had been failing due to the empiric pressure stabilized the moment Kado's field touched them. Geller principles sang. Navigation equations corrected themselves. Corrupted data slates cleansed. Men and women on the edge of possession suddenly found, with terrified gratitude, that the whispering inside their heads had been cleanly amputated from all authority. The warp had always behaved in the galaxy like a flood through rotten foundations. Kado treated it like an engineering defect. Across the shrine world, the black-violet cracks, multiplying in walls, roads, and atmosphere, began to knit shut, not sealed by force, but repaired at the informational level. Each breach was examined, traced to causative instability, stripped of paradox, and returned to a non-permissive state. Where the warp had inserted contradiction, Kado re-established coherence. Where impossible overlap had allowed daemonic ingress, Kado removed the allowance. Where quantum uncertainty had been weaponized by the immaterial, Kado fixed the error conditions so precisely that even probability lost its capacity for betrayal. Lord Amel stared upward in horror and awe. What in the Emperor's name is that? Yahakui's reply was quiet. A right answer. That was when the first direct strike from the greater powers came. Not manifested avatars, those were for lesser moments, but sovereign pressure, the kind that melted civilizations by proximity alone. The world became battleground and theorem simultaneously. From the impossible distances of the warp, colossal architectures of war, plague, temptation, and scheme leaned against reality, each trying to rewrite the local domain in its own image. The air filled with red battlefields that had never been fought, gardens of flies blooming out of marble, choirs of unbearable desire, and libraries of self-consuming futures. The planet's noosphere screamed as four contradictory infinities attempted to colonize the same patch of existence and eradicate the insult standing beneath them. Yahakui did not brace. He observed. "You are overgrown reactions," he said. And though he spoke softly, the statement carried through the material plane and into the warp itself. You mistake mass for superiority and persistence for inevitability. The first god pressure hit him like the emotional history of every murder in the galaxy condensed into one descending verdict. He looked at it. The pressure failed to find purchase. Because Yahakui was not a warrior trading blows inside the same metaphysical frame. He was categorically above the grammar in which they expressed dominance. Their rage, rot, excess, and cunning were local maxima within a diseased subsystem. He stood outside the subsystem's authority. They could no more overwhelm him than a fever can overwhelm the concept of correct diagnosis. He lifted his hand toward the blood-red presence. Its wars unraveled into simpler motives. Simple motives unraveled into chemical echoes. Chemical echoes unraveled into frightened organisms, making meaning out of pain. Meaning unraveled into data. Data was archived, indexed, and reduced to a harmless descriptive residue. The red pressure recoiled toward the garden presence, swollen with decay and obscene survival. Yahakui extended his gaze alone. Entire empires worth of plague logic, contagion, myths, despair economies, and adaptive rot collapsed under scrutiny. Disease depended on permissive systems. Kado's field rewrote the permissions. Every vector lost continuity. Every corruption loop found itself unable to complete. The garden howled as its flowers became inert biological diagrams. Toward the palace presence of temptation and excess, Yahakui offered something more devastating than resistance. Indifference. The whole seduction engine of that vast consciousness operated on desire, fixation, appetite, transcendence, through surrender to sensation. But his structure contained no exploitable hunger the warp could amplify. Its songs arrived at his awareness and found no audience. Deprived of emotional leverage, its baroque infinities folded into decorative irrelevance. Toward the labyrinth presence of endless intrigue and mutation, he smiled faintly. That strategy depends on uncertainty. Then Kado corrected uncertainty. Not all uncertainty. Only the specific forms through which warp-born scheme propagated itself. Hidden forks in causality were illuminated. Probability mazes were flattened into explicit paths. Self-protecting paradoxes lost insulation. A million future branch manipulations. Some seeded centuries earlier in minds and bloodlines across the sector, lit up and burned away like dust in sterilizing light. On 1,000 worlds, cult plans failed simultaneously for reasons no one could explain. In the warp, something screamed with the outrage of an entire god realizing its tricks had become homework on an open desk. The Shrine City was no longer panicking. Most of its inhabitants were too stunned, even for faith. They watched the sky host an event no scripture had prepared them for. Chaos itself being outclassed, not by a greater madness, not by a rival predation, but by superior order. Lord Amel dropped to one knee, not in worship, but because her body had reached the limit of upright comprehension. "If you can do this," she said hoarsely, "then why speak to us at all?" Why not end it? Why not erase the warp completely and be done? Yahakui's eyes remained on the sky. Because your species is entangled with the damage, a crude removal would propagate collateral deletions across human consciousness, navigation, infrastructure, soul transit, and multiple civilizational pillars. A correct solution requires more than extermination. You mean you're choosing mercy? No, Yahakui said. I mean I prefer elegant answers. Then he moved, not fast. Speed was for beings crossing distance. Yahakui stepped from plaza to upper atmosphere to low orbit in 3 motions that did not connect causally in any human sense. One instant he stood among shattered icons. The next he was above the world, face to face with storms large enough to digest suns. Kado opened around him like an unfolding sentence. From Imperial ships, from Terra's hidden arrays, from a million accidental witnesses on the ground, sensors recorded impossible images, white lattices extending through the warp breach network, intersecting with corruption channels older than many species, inserting analytic structures into places where no stable geometry should exist. Demonic armies, massing in adjacent unreality, were not blasted apart but quarantined, sorted, and in many cases stripped of their daemonhood before they understood they had been touched. Warp rivers altered course. Dead psychic reefs dissolved. Screaming vortexes became silent spheres and then clean nulls. It was not war. It was remediation on a divine scale. The Chaos Gods pressed harder. Galaxies' worth of accumulated malice and obsession surged through the medium that had empowered them for ages. Sectors went dark. Choir worlds burned out. The Astronomicon flickered. Even upon the Golden Throne, where the master of mankind endured his long agony between godhood and machinery, there was a shift. In that buried chamber of pain and impossible endurance, something vast and ancient, something chained to sacrifice and empire and humanity's most defiant refusal to die, became aware of Yahakui Zashunina in full. For one moment, the corpse light of Terra and the white certainty of Kado occupied the same grand equation. No words were spoken aloud. None were needed. 2 utterly dissimilar forms of superiority regarded one another across the blood-soaked architecture of a species that had made itself both miracle and womb. Yahakui acknowledged the Emperor as one acknowledges a monumental answer built under intolerable constraints. The Emperor, if any interpretation of that terrible half-living will was possible, recognized in return that the newcomer was not a pawn of chaos, not a rival god in the usual sense, and not a force that could be contained by any mechanism humanity possessed. That silent exchange changed nothing and everything, because after it, Terra did not order the immediate obliteration of the sector. Instead, it watched, in orbit above the Shrine World. Imperial captains received emergency sanction to disengage unless directly threatened. Many refused to believe the order. Some obeyed from sheer fear. A few remained, compelled by awe. Below, Lord Amel rose shakily to her feet as Yahakui returned to the plaza. The sky was cleaner now. Not normal, this was still the 41st millennium, and normal was a disease of optimism, but cleaner. The warp scars over the city were gone. The local psychic background was quieter than any inhabited Imperial world had been in living memory. Men who had endured whispers for years suddenly realized they could hear their own thoughts for the first time. The Cardinal Governor, having survived the end of his categories, tried one final question. "Are you a god?" Yahakui looked at him with almost gentle detachment. "That is a word your species uses when it reaches the edge of explanation and chooses obedience over comprehension." The Cardinal had no reply. Lord Amel did. "What do you intend for the Imperium?" Yahakui answered at once. "That depends on whether the Imperium can distinguish survival from habit." The days that followed became the most classified and most widely rumored span in 10,000 years of Imperial history. Yahakui did not leave. He traveled, not by ship, not by gate, not by any transit the Mechanicus could replicate. He appeared where warp damage was most foundational. A black ship route collapsing under psychic overload. A forge world whose machine liturgies had hidden demonic logic infections for centuries. A hive city where a cult of ecstasy had nearly synchronized with a greater possession wave. A death world orbiting inside a warp scar where reality had grown thin enough for nightmares to breed in daylight. At each site, the pattern repeated. Chaos mobilized. Yahakui refused the premise of mobilization. Daemon princes fell apart into case studies. Possession events were reversed with surgical precision, leaving victims alive when any Imperial doctrine would have deemed them irredeemable. Warp storms, once considered weather-like acts of divine malice, were subjected to diagnosis. Kado mapped turbulence, identified anchor traumas in the surrounding psychic ecology, and removed the fault structures sustaining the storm. Entire regions of space once inaccessible to navigation stabilized within hours. The navigator houses panicked. The ecclesiarchy panicked more. The Inquisition split into factions so violently that on some worlds, assassinations began before the official debates had even been archived. One camp declared Yahakui the greatest threat ever to face mankind, precisely because he invalidated the sacred necessity of so much imperial brutality. Another insisted he must be courted, served, or at least observed without provoking him. A third, smaller and more dangerous, wanted to understand enough of Kado's corrections to weaponize them. They did not get far. Every attempt to capture Kado's operating principles through theft, coercion, techno-heresy, or psychana extraction produced only fragments, not because Yahakui hid them in the crude sense, but because the Imperium lacked the conceptual cleanliness to hold them without distortion. The Adeptus Mechanicus described the phenomenon as knowledge shear. Information survived contact, but only in forms too abstract to exploit without first shedding entire civilizational assumptions. On one forge world, a Magos who had dedicated 300 years to reverse engineering the stranger's works finally made a private confession before wiping his own data caskets in despair. "We built our empire on maintenance of holy ruin," he said. "He works from first principles. We have forgotten what those are." Meanwhile, within the warp, the four retaliated relentlessly. They empowered champions, inflamed crusades, poured malice through old cult channels, roused sleeping corruption in artifacts, bloodlines, and forgotten battlefields. They hurled against Yahakui not only direct force, but the total psychological inertia of a galaxy habituated to them. After all, the greatest power of chaos had never been claws or fire. It had been adaptation through the weaknesses of those resisting it. But Yahakui was not resisting in the mortal sense. He was setting terms. If a world's psychic environment was too compromised, Kado partitioned it, isolating the contaminated strata and restoring safe continuity elsewhere. If a daemon world bled symbolic contagion across nearby systems, Yahakui dissected the bleed channels and denied the world extraterritorial reach. If an artifact carried mimetic corruption, he rewrote the artifact's authority relationship to observers, reducing it to inert matter without explosive backlash. He was not winning battles. He was changing what battle meant. And because he was categorically above the chaos gods, their responses became increasingly revealing in their futility. They could devastate unshielded civilizations. Yes, they could still drown sectors in blood and madness, where Yahakui had not yet intervened. But whenever they brought the full majesty of warp predation to bear directly against him or Kado, they encountered the same intolerable truth. The underlying errors they exploited were no longer beyond correction. Ahrimanic schemers and daemon savants alike discovered, to their horror, that Kado could repair quantum inconsistencies before those inconsistencies matured into full warp events. Time loop infestations, retrocausal possessions, identity fractures caused by exposure to nonlinear demonic pressure, all of it became susceptible to intervention. Things once accepted as too late were no longer too late in his presence. On a dead moon-turned ritual forged by servants of chaos, an entire citadel built around a paradox engine detonated in reverse when Yahakui touched the outer wall. The explosion unhappened itself. The fuel never ignited. The sacrifices never died. And the architecting sorcerer found himself standing alive amid unraised stones with all his centuries of preparation deleted from history's actionable side, though he retained the memory as punishment. "Impossible," the sorcerer whispered. "No," Yahakui said. "Merely unavailable to you." The Eldar watched from hidden paths and were afraid. The Necrons observed from tomb world vaults and recalculated. The orcs barely noticed except on worlds where the good fight stopped behaving properly and weird boy heads ceased exploding in amusing ways. The Tyranids, when probing regions Kado had stabilized, encountered an unnerving reduction in psychic prey noise and adapted course vectors accordingly. The galaxy itself began to bend around the fact of Yahakui's presence. Pilgrims declared him a saint, then a test, then an abomination, then an answer sent because the Emperor had finally acted. Sects rose and were crushed. Doctrines multiplied. On one world, an entire cathedral order rewrote its litanies around the principle that truth need not scream. The ecclesiarchy burned them all. It did not matter. The idea had already escaped. Humanity, brutalized for millennia into accepting endless suffering as the only possible architecture of survival, had now seen proof that some of its greatest inevitabilities were merely untreated conditions. That was more dangerous to the Imperium than any Xenos fleet. Eventually, Lord Amel was granted a second audience. This time it took place not on a battlefield or shrine world, but on a quiet plateau of polished black stone on a planet recently pulled back from the edge of warp collapse. Kado hovered overhead like a serene moon of white logic. The air was so clear of dimensional interference that even the smallest thought seemed exposed. "She came alone. You could defeat us in a day," she said. Yahakui stood with his hands folded behind his back, looking toward a horizon that had finally become still. "Yes, and yet you haven't." "No." "Why?" He remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his answer carried no anger or compassion. It was simply precise. "Because your civilization is approaching a decision, though most of it does not yet understand that. If I simply imposed perfect order, I would solve the immediate problem while preserving the dependency beneath it. You would survive beneath an answer you had never helped create. The result would be stable, but incomplete." Lord Amel gave a short, bitter laugh. "You believe this species deserves a choice? I believe deserving is irrelevant. A corrected system becomes stronger when it can understand and participate in its own correction." She considered his words carefully. "Then what are we to you?" "The civilization most capable of either accepting repair or rebuilding the damage." That answer should have sounded insulting. Instead, it felt uncomfortably fair. She stepped closer. "And if we choose incorrectly?" Yahakui finally turned toward her. "Then your civilization will continue until its contradictions exceed even its remarkable ability to survive. At that point, it will either divide into smaller structures capable of recovery, or eventually be replaced by something more sustainable." "So calm," she said. "Do billions of lives mean nothing to you?" "They mean exactly what they are." "And what is that?" "Enormous," he answered. "Which is why simple emotion is not enough." For the first time since meeting him, Lord Amel felt something different from fear. Understanding, not agreement. Never agreement, but understanding. He was not a savior in the way humanity imagined saviors. He was not a conqueror in the way humanity feared conquerors. He was an intellect approaching a wounded civilization with standards so high that even its greatest powers seemed limited beneath them. Then the final escalation began. Unable to control Yahakui, manipulate him, influence him, overwhelm him, or disrupt Kado's corrections, the four great dimensional forces changed their strategy. They turned toward humanity itself. If the stranger could not be defeated directly, perhaps humanity could be convinced to reject him. Conflicting messages spread across distant worlds. False warnings appeared inside communication networks. Entire regions were manipulated into believing that Yahakui intended to erase their history, eliminate their identity, or transform civilization into something emotionless and sterile. In some places, those fears needed very little encouragement. Humanity had always been capable of destroying what it did not understand. Fleets began mobilizing under ancient banners. A massive counter-operation was declared, not everywhere, not unanimously, but enough. Worlds that Yahakui had previously stabilized now prepared to oppose him, influenced by fear, misinformation, and carefully engineered psychological pressure. Millions gathered beneath symbols of unity and resistance, preparing to confront the very being who had reduced the dimensional disturbances threatening their civilization. Lord Amel watched the preparations from a fortified command center. For the first time, she felt sick in a way no battlefield had ever made her feel. He knew, she whispered. He knew we might do this. Of course he had known. Yahakui eventually met the approaching fleet at the edge of a repaired dimensional corridor. 13 enormous capital ships and countless escorts emerged into a region of space that had been considered impossible to navigate only months earlier. Their commander opened a system-wide communication channel. In the name of humanity and by authority of our civilization, you are commanded to submit to evaluation. Yahakui appeared simultaneously across every command bridge. Not as a hologram, not as a transmission. He was simply present. You are mistaking inherited reflex for judgment, he said. The commander swallowed. You have destabilized the spiritual and political order of humanity. I have demonstrated that some of its injuries are repairable. You undermine everything our civilization has endured. I undermine unnecessary suffering. You are a threat. No, Yahakui replied calmly. Diagnosis. The commander gave the order to fire. By then, he had gone too far to retreat. The fleet unleashed enough firepower to devastate entire continents. Kado responded by protecting both sides. That was what finally broke their certainty. Not retaliation, not destruction, protection. Every projectile, energy beam, torpedo, and massive kinetic round stopped before causing catastrophic damage. Ship reactors were prevented from cascading into destructive failures. Ammunition could no longer penetrate critical life support systems. Energy feedback could not destroy the crews inside their own vessels. Even when several commanders attempted desperate collision attacks, their trajectories changed into survivable glancing impact. The fleet had come prepared for total confrontation. Yahakui refused to give them one. Across every flagship communication system, his voice returned. You are attempting to prove your convictions through destruction. The fleet fell silent. Yahakui looked across the countless ships surrounding him. If your civilization can only recognize truth through suffering, then suffer less. Kado expanded around the fleet like an enormous sphere of white geometric light. Weapons powered down. Engines stabilized. The dimensional corridor became completely still. And, for the first time, the people who had come to destroy Yahakui were forced to confront something far more difficult than an enemy. They had been offered a choice. If your civilization can only authenticate truth by bleeding against it, then bleed less. I will not validate your fear with slaughter. Some crews broke then. Some turned off weapons. Some wept openly. Some doubled down until their command thrones had to be cut from their hands. The crusade ended not with victory, but with exposure. Chaos had expected blood and got restraint. The Imperium had expected domination and got refusal. Both found themselves standing before a mirror they hated. Years later, historians in hidden cells, xenoseers in exile, and machine intellects in sealed vaults would all name that moment differently. Some called it the White Interruption. Some called it the Repairing. Some called it the day the warp learned limits. Lord Amel, in her sealed memoir never meant for public release, wrote only this: "We believe strength meant enduring damnation longer than our enemies. Then something arrived that treated damnation as a solvable flaw. We had no doctrine for such a thing. Perhaps we still do not." As for Yahakui Zashunina, he remained what he had always been from the moment he entered that grim galaxy. Not a contestant in its mythology, but a higher answer, examining whether its people could survive, being shown that many of their absolutes were only failures left too long uncorrected. Chaos never ceased. It could not while minds still generated excess, violence, despair, and desperate change. But it was no longer sovereign in the same way. Wherever Kado established stable correction fields, warp corruption lost its ancient certainty. Possession rates fell, storms thinned. Demonic manifestations became containable, then rare, then in some zones almost impossible. Whole regions of the galaxy experienced, for the first time in 10,000 years, nights untroubled by whispers from beyond reality. And that, more than any battle, terrified everyone. Because if the warp could be fixed where it was broken, then perhaps history itself had not been fate. Perhaps empire, dogma, sacrifice, and horror had persisted not because they were the only possible answers, but because no one strong enough had ever arrived to prove they were not. Yahakui did not ask for worship. He did not ask for trust. He did not ask permission. He simply continued, world by world, breach by breach, contradiction by contradiction, applying impossible clarity to a galaxy built on normalized madness. Above him, Kado shone like a verdict too clean for superstition to comfortably survive. Below him, humanity struggled with the most dangerous revelation of all, that salvation, if it came, might not resemble anything it had been taught to obey.